Tell us a little bit about what you remember to be the debate, the discussion about the urban renewal project of the 50s and 60s.
Well, here again, not much because I was a child when it started. I was only 12. But I have read quite extensively about it and has been able to put that in some frame of reference. I do remember people talking about it. No one liked it, but I must say that no one means everyone. The urban renewal was never, at least as I can recall, ever discussed in terms of race, class. It was something that just should not have been done. It was totally wrong. The number of blacks and whites, businesses that were owned by both groups, pretty much equal. My family just sort of like, this is what happens, you take it and you move on. You can sit here and dwell on it and you can debate it, but it will not change the fact of what is going to happen. So that's...
Well, from your study, tell us how it did happen. Give us kind of a
Well, it happened because years ago, 200 years ago, when this city was first conceived, the idea of a nation's capital, it was always thought that the city would develop and grow east. It never happened. There were a number of plans, starts and fits that never happened over the past 200 years. In the late 1800s, it was thought of that they would do Anacostia first, that would be the appropriate area. Why? Because in some earlier documents, it was suggested that that was the more appropriate place because of the great views that you would want your chanceries and embassies of other states and international delegations at. In the late 1800s, there became this great social concern about what urban centers were breeding, not just here in Washington, but universally across the country. And of course, the area here was viewed. However, it was never the intent of Congress to bulldoze the entire community. What happened was the bureaucracy at the time and those involved in the bureaucracy said, you know, we don't know how to do this kind of surgical stuff. When you go in and you do this, but you don't touch this, we can go in, we can bulldoze, and we can start from scratch. Well, that's great if you have a comprehensive plan to implement. There was never truly a comprehensive plan for the development of Southwest. It was quadrant off in the areas A, B, C, and D, and I think we're sitting, yeah, we're still in the C area. And if you look around you today here in Southwest, you seem to notice that there's this disconnect between developments. There doesn't seem to be one set style or design that would sort of bring this piece all together. And the reason being is that that's what happened. They demolished it and then, okay, well, now what do we do? Well, we've got to build something. And of course, it all started with the great runabout to see who could come in and who could develop this, that, and the other. Webb, Knapp, which did your neighbors here, the Town Center Plaza area, which does not look like the initial artist renderings of what was supposed to be here. You go over here to Capitol Park. That doesn't seem to fit with Tiber Island or any other places. You go to the project area, into the Greenleaf dwellings there, which was, believe it or not a part of the original redevelopment plan. So you had all of these different types of things that have cropped up. So they just put it together, but never did come up with a comprehensive development plan. So much so that several of the parcels are still under discussion today. You have the remainder of the Portal site over where the Mandarin Hotel is. You have this huge quadrant off of South Capitol Street from M heading south. That's all a part of the original development area. And they still have not resolved that. Lower areas, upper areas of the Buzzards Point area, near the Pepco power facility. Those areas still are waiting to be developed.
There was no account for public housing?
Not as I recall the plan. When I read back to the documents, there was a suggestion that those who were here would be given first opportunity to live in all of the new development that was here. Much later that I hear talk of a Greenleaf public housing project and so on, which I find was designed many years after the plan was first formulated. Both the high rises on M Street, the developments going down to the Syfax area, and all of those. The only early on design plan with respect, and they didn't call it redevelopment then, it was with respect to developing what they called sanitary housing. There's still some indications of that historically along Carlsberg, and then you have the Syfax Greenleaf or James Creek development right there. But those were already established areas. But the newer areas in and around I and Delaware, 3rd and all of that, they came much later, and it appeared to have been an afterthought in the process.
Who really made this happen? Who are the people that really made it work, made it go?
The development itself?
Yeah. Was there a driving political figure in this?
Not really. I still, when I look back at the historical documents, it was haphazard. There was no one, there were a lot of speculators after the land was there and it became dormant, but there was no cohesive effort in the development community where you could say that this group formed up to do this group formed up to do that, or they put together a collaborative to do maybe this project and that project. I've never found that. I found it were all these different little pockets of individuals. Couple that with the fact that you had a federal housing authority and the redevelopment land agency, which had all of this land. Look, we've got to do something with this stuff. And they just started reaching and pulling in and so on. But no, there was no one central force behind any of it that I can identify. Yes, sir. I'm sorry.
203?
Oh no, that came much later. Late 50s, early 60s. Row houses.
What year was the RLA organized?
It was back in the 30s, part of the old Federal Housing Administration.
And upon its charter, was it granted the authority of eminent domain?
Eventually it was. Keep in mind that the government has always held true that they have that right. And this goes back to the earlier days of development of the country, that whenever the government felt that it was in the best interest of the broader community, the government has always held that.
Manifest destiny.
Manifest destiny. And as a matter of fact, a court, the Supreme Court and others have always stated that that is a correct view, so long as they develop a process for implementing it. So it's always been there, but this is the first time it was ever applied on such a broad scale.
Today there are about 12,000 of us who live here in Southwest. Do you remember the approximate population before they turned on the
Yeah, and I have I want to say it was closer to 18 or 20,000. I have the exact number somewhere.
And by the 50s, there was still housing that went all the way to Independence, all the way up to the mall?
Oh, yes. Yeah. My paper route was on Independence Avenue and Maryland Avenue. There were families still living in those areas. It was a residential area.
Row houses?
Row houses. It was a residential area.
Like the rest of the community?
Like the rest of the community. A lot of red brick we had down here. But we also had a number of really gleaming homes. There were a number of mansions over on bigger homes on 6th Street. There was Old Man Lewis's old mansion, which was, I want to say that was the 2000 or 1900 block of 1st Street. There were homes all the way up to Delaware Avenue, where you have the house complex where the Reverend building currently sits. Delaware Avenue went straight up. before its development of that site. And there were homes still there. In the photographic archives of the Martin Luther King Washingtoniana Division, they have the aerial shots taken of this area pre-redevelopment, and you see the wealth of housing stock here. But not just the total wealth, but architecturally, this area held some of the largest strands of federal-style housing anywhere on the East Coast. And some of the row houses are very much the house that I lived in on I Street. I could take you to an area, 15th and Kentucky Avenue Southeast, where someone has sought to recreate that exact style of home, and particularly with respect to facade, with the bay window area and so on. So it was architecturally, it was also a rich strand of housing here.
Tell us a little bit more about how that all settled in with folks. The myth is that everyone would have an opportunity to come back to a newly rebuilt community.
Yeah.
But of course, that even by the architect's drawings, that was not true to begin with.
I remember when Capitol Park Apartments opened, then people began to realize that this is never going to happen. And keep in mind then that they were talking about top rents then of only $150 to $160 a month in some cases. And that was just out of the reach of most of the people here at that time. There were a number of suits that went on that were finally dismissed. Most of the people just sort of said, okay, well, we'll just move on. And the people were dispersed throughout the city. But I find that there's probably more lamenting over all of that today than at the time that it was actually happening.
Really?
Yes, as the city begins to transition itself once again into another level, I hear more discussions about Southwest now than I recall hearing when I was a young man, particularly with the current development plans for the waterfront and the lower quadrants of Southeast.
Why do you suppose that is?
It's what I call the never again mentality. You did it to us once, and we can assure you we will not permit this to happen again. Southwest was just bureaucracy and development out of control. And as a matter of fact, if you go anywhere in the world and to study urban planning, one of the case scenarios that they will give you of what never to do is the case history of Southwest. This is what you should never do if you're going to be a good urban planner.
You mean go into it without a plan?
Go into it without a plan and without a broad sense of community involvement.
We've heard someone state that one of the reasons behind the drive to redevelop this community was the photographs that Khrushchev had of Washington, that had the blighted areas of Southwest in the foreground and the Capitol in the background. And he was showing this all over Europe when the Cold War started to get really going in the 50s. And the Eisenhower administration wanted to diffuse that propaganda material.
The plan to redevelop Washington and Southwest was already in motion even as we were winding down World War II. If you go back to the historical documents, you will see that redevelopment and restructuring of neighborhoods had been discussed at that time, maybe 40 or 50 years. So no, I've heard that before. That's just like the suggestion that race was the driving factor behind the redevelopment here. Well, I'd like to bring some of the Lewises over here. I'd like to bring some of the Levis over here and ask them, said, hey, if it was just to get rid of blacks, then how did you guys get kicked out? And hear their response to it.
Yeah. Did the folks who left, did they just completely scatter, or did folks cluster in other parts of town?
No, they were pretty much scattered. Myself, we moved to the Capitol Hill, which was and already had extended family living in that area. We moved into what became the Capitol Hill area. There were expansion of projects in Congress Heights, the East Capitol Street area, and Northwest. So they were pretty much scattered throughout the city. In certain areas, there was not really by intent some clustering. It's just that former neighbors ended up being new neighbors once again, but not by design. There is one point, maybe I should interject this at this stage. One of the things that has been suggested that, and as people often attribute to some of the problems that we face today, that with this dispersal and putting everyone out has led to the decline in other areas of the city, and that is just definitely not true. When I look at the areas, let's take when blacks were permitted to move into Anacostia in areas other than the historic Anacostia district, such as Parklands, which was a Cafridge project that was developed back in the early 50s. Most of the blacks who lived there were extremely well-educated, qualified, and professional. There were places up along Rhode Island Avenue Northeast where the same thing. So this idea that the people here were the genesis for a lot of the present day problems because of what they supposedly did not bring with them intellectually or culturally is sheer myth. And it's people suggesting that that mainly because I guess it serves present day agendas or ends. But I hear that a lot, that along with the Khrushchev photograph stuff, you know. Really, 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 I laugh every time I hear that.
But it's one of those things, those stories and that history thrives in a vacuum. And there has been, as there is today, not enough clear institutional memory, which you're one of the rare folks around to be able to preserve that. And there's not a real clear sense about what we want. And that is in my opinion, I've been here for 10 years. The people in this community are really unsure what kind of community they want to live in at all. They know they don't like this and they don't like that, but they don't like high buildings and they don't like too much traffic and lots of other things. The old neighborhood seems that people were really settled in with what they wanted.
They were. We you know, it's funny. We knew not so much what we wanted because we had what we wanted. We had a sense of community, we had family, we had associations, and all of that. And that's why I tell people, if I were to be born again today, I would want to be born in Southwest, into the same family, into the same community with the same neighbors that I was 63 years ago. I would never, never trade that experience for anything. Not ever.
That's a wonderful gift.
So,
yeah.
Knowing what I want and knowing what people want today, I'm very much involved in some projects, and I think it'll be getting to the young man's question earlier about, I understand what you say when you say, what is it that they wanted, what did we want? People here basically wanted to be let alone and to carry on their lives. Eventually, those blighted areas would have cleaned themselves up. And that comes out of never really fully through a government program, because neighborhoods, no matter where they are, have always evolved. They reach great pinnacles, they reach areas of decline. That's part of the human endeavor. So given enough time, the community in the blighted areas would have changed and began to change more and more. They mainly wanted the fraternity and the association that a close-knit community brought to everyone. And I think that's why so many people reminisce and lament about the loss of all of this. Because as I said in an earlier statement, so much of what I hear people trying to do today, I'm like, yeah, well, been there, did that one years ago in Southwest. And particularly when the young men who are seated here before me, I hear all of the discussion about what we should do with our youth today. We're losing them. Well, first of all, you know what I'd like to do? I'd like to let you guys be young men. I don't want you at your age to worry about being an adult like me. You're not supposed to. You're supposed to have all of the fancies, all of the curiosities of a young man. Once in a while, you're going to do something really stupid. And guess what? I hope you do, because that's your measuring stick as to how you grow. That's how you grow. So those are the types of things that we had, and that's what I would do. And you could take it back to what did we do with young kids? We let them be young men. We reminded them, don't worry, there's going to be an appropriate time in your life when you're going to become an adult. Just worry about being a good young man today, and you're going to be a fantastic adult. That's one of the other great things that Southwest did for me. And that's what I would impart to young people today, and still do.
Let's shift and talk about some of the contemporary issues, some of the development projects around the community that bring, again, more of the issues that have always been in the soil here to life. But before that, clarify for us your educational career path. You said that you went to, you said the school that was here on...
Jefferson?
No, the elementary school.
S.J. Bowen. S.J. Bowen, Smallwood, S.J. Bowen Elementary School.
Yes.
Smallwood was the black school before, well, actually it changed before then. About 2 years before, no, longer than that now, 48, 6 years before that, they decided to close Smallwood Elementary School, which was this huge, beautiful old red brick structure.
Right here on this block?
Yes, in the 300 block of I Street. That's where I started out in elementary school. Miss Jolie was my kindergarten teacher. As a matter of fact, let's get this out of the way now, because this young man is like, this guy doesn't remember all of this stuff. Kindergarten, Miss Jolie was my teacher. First grade was Miss Waters. Second grade was Miss Butler. Third grade was Miss Clark, who eventually became Miss Harris. Fifth grade was Miss Perkins. Sixth grade was Miss Davis. My principal's name for the first 4 years was a guy named Dr. Jones, and then later years, Miss Ham. Okay? Okay. See?
That's pretty good. You went on to Bowen.
Yes, went to Anthony Bowen, S.J. Bowen, Sales J. Bowen, after they closed Smallwood.
And finished eighth grade.
I finished the sixth grade there, and then by this time, schools had integrated. It had been a tradition in my family to go to Randall. All of my sibling group above me all attended Randall, as did my mother. As a matter of fact, her mom was actually president of the Randall PTA 27, 28, and 29 in the 1900s. So we had a great tradition there. And that's the school that most of the blacks in Washington went to up until they developed other schools. In the 40s, if you were black and you lived east of the Capitol building and you went to junior high school, no matter where you lived, if you lived in deep Anacostia, if you lived in far northeast or far southeast, you went to Randall. That was the only black junior high school on that end.
It must have been a huge school.
It was. It was a huge school. Okay. Now, as far as high schools, eventually they opened Spingarn in the early 50s. You went to Cardozo, Armstrong, or Dunbar. Cardozo was for those who were not going off to college, supposedly. Dunbar was the college preparatory school. Armstrong was the technical school, not a vocational school as it is so often taught today. That was the technical school. Then we had one black voc school here, which was Phelps early on. So those were the schools. So no matter where you lived, Once you got to a certain level in school, you went to certain schools, and it's so much so today that I'm quite sure, all of you guys, your parents all come from Washington, I take it. But for those of you who do, who have generational connection, I'm willing to bet you if I sit down with your parents and talk to them, we would know someone in common if we did not know each other, or I would know your grandparents. Because the areas that we associated in were very limited, and thus we had all of these associations, and specifically with respect to schools.
Did you say you went to Jefferson?
Went to Jefferson. 7th, 8th, 9th grade there. Hugh Stewart Smith was the principal. Miss Jameson, who, believe it or not, is still living. She lives over on Tennessee Avenue, Southeast. Dr. Vincent Reed was one of the stellar teachers there. Dr. Reed eventually became superintendent of schools here in Washington. We had Miss Irene Hepting, Miss Hunt. My favorite, two of my favorite teachers from that day would be Miss Hamlin, my music teacher, and Dr. Paget, who was my science teacher. For a number of reasons, I picked those because I love music, and I'm a science buff until this very day. I still tinker with all of that stuff. And Dr. Paget was a great compliment to what I'd already learned about science and things through the Police Boys Club. And then, of course, Miss Birchfield, who became my art teacher, who was a great compliment to Mr. Green, who taught me art and drawing here at the Police Boys Club before that. But it was a very good experience. It was a trying experience because there were a lot of misconceptions when schools were integrated here. A lot of the black children who went to Jefferson, we had a problem. As I mentioned earlier, I was reading books that I had read years before. You know, I wanted to know how to build a rocket, not how to mix up sulfur and make a stink bomb in a science class. I'm sorry. So there was this great intellectual gulf in between. Okay. I wanted to learn how and continue to learn how to play golf. By this time, I was hooked on sailing. I was more interested in that than running track or football, so much so that when I got to high school, I did not play any sports. If I couldn't play golf, if we didn't have a sailing team or rowing team, then I didn't want to. But that's where we came out of. Now you look at me and say, well, how rowing? Well, got to remember one of the best rowing teams in the country back in the day was Howard University, not Harvard and Yale. The only problem is that the white schools would never permit them to compete in any of the events. But it never dried up my appetite to learn how to row, and that's how I ended up founding a rowing club over on the Anacostia 18 years now ago. And we still row today over there whenever I get a chance to. So that's how I ended up educationally. College-wise, I went to UDC eventually.
High school, you went to?
Eastern.
Eastern.
Going to high school here, as going to junior high school, because of all of the Ole Miss, was really a challenge for me too, because there again, there was this big misunderstanding about young blacks my age and what we were not capable of doing. Had done this many, many years ago. As far as college, I waited much later in life to go to college because college did not provide me the intellectual stimulation that I had been looking for. Back in the day, there were a number of ways in which you could read a book and find associations, either through the Police Boys Club or through your parents, grandparents, through their associations, through various fraternities, sororities, church associations, where you could go in and hear discussions about great things. College, by this time in the 60s, it began to transition. It didn't offer me that. There was none of this, what we'd call the Aristotelian belief, where you would be seated in a great amphitheater and you would thought a couple of theorems or theses and you would sit there and debate them. Colleges had changed. They had become too, I guess, too much about placating people based on their social and racial standing. than trying to placate and appease the mind. So I waited until much later to go to college, and then elected to go to UDC.
What did you do when you left high school?
Military, and I worked and read books, which was, and I like to think of it, even though I had a job and worked after I got out of the service, I think my full-time job was more reading. I was noted for reading 3, 4 o'clock in the morning every night of the week, and I still do it. If you go out to my car and you open the trunk, I have my little traveling library. I have a milk crate. Well, that's my traveling library. And that was also one of my more important jobs after high school, was reading as much as I can and taking in as much art and culture as I could.
Did your military service give you an opportunity to travel?
No, I was stateside mostly. I was a combat MP. Fort Knox, Fort Gordon, Fort McClellan, Alabama. Actually did 6 months at the military disciplinary barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, which was an interesting place to be a military policeman at. It was a maximum security prison. Taught me a lot about human behavior, but a great experience. And occasionally I've had to draw on some of the experiences there while I was stationed at Fort Leavenworth. But a great experience. My military experience was good. And then I came back and served in the National Guard, which was a tradition here. Being a southern town, both black and white guys belonged to the National Guard unit. It was an association. It was an extension of the broader community here. A gentleman passed a couple of years ago, Major General Covington Bryant, and people were amazed at the thousands and thousands of young men who showed up. Well, he started out in the DC National Guard back in the early 1940s. He grew up here, was educated here, and it was that association that the National Guard units brought to you. They were all my old neighbors, so I continued that association.
It's an unusual life that you've lived, that you relied on the community resources more than the institutional resources of the city for making you who you are.
Yeah.
These were things that were here. Things were available to you.
Things were available.
And you took advantage.
And you took advantage.
But you're exceptional in that, don't you think?
No, I don't think so. Not by any stretch of the imagination am I exceptional.
Well, I've got a lot of friends, and I don't know too many people who've got a library in their trunk.
Oh, I have a lot of friends who do keep libraries in the trunk, even if it's just one book.
Yeah.
And they all grew up here. Mm-hmm. Very rarely will you find me without a book to read. It's just something that I do. It's a passion. Mm-hmm. And I do it simply for this simple, number one, there's no great endeavor than committing your life to letters. It's a fantastic thing to do. But more importantly, I read because that's how I continue to grow. I'm 63, haven't finished growing yet. And why? Because there are millions of books that I haven't read yet. So that's what reading does. It's a constant growing for me. I always pick up something new. They delivered this right as I was leaving today. I belong to a group called Photocraft. It's the oldest African-American photography club in the world. And I love my photography. And to make my point about reading and grabbing something to read, it's one shot right here. I studied that shot before pulling off this morning, and I'm like, wow, I've been trying to do that at a couple of sites here in Washington. So what I will do is that I will find this guy's notes online, and I will study them. And you know what it does? It helps me to grow as a photographer. So that's the great thing about literacy that I love, and that's why I do it. And I'm not unique. You got to remember also that I grew up in a town where there was free access to the public libraries, but also less than 6 blocks from my house if I go up New Jersey or go up Delaware and get to Independence and turn to my right and walk east for a couple of blocks, the Library of Congress. And I played in that building and explored that place. And then it was just the Jefferson Building. The old Carnegie Library, which I'm now a part of a group trying to help to retain and restore her. I mean, why not? It was just all there. I just would go out. And to close out on that point, I think that's one thing that young people today could learn. What you have before you may not be the most desirable, but you find out that you have all of these things that are open to you. Take advantage of it. That's all I was encouraged to do. Never lock yourself out because. Just never exclude yourself because. Always include yourself in every endeavor.
That's wonderful. Let's talk a little bit about some of the current issues in the community. You serve as a director of the Anacostia Waterfront Corporation.
Yeah, I'm one of the directors.
And that is the new entity that has been created here to help to facilitate the redevelopment of the waterfront and other areas in the city. Tell us a little bit about what the Anacostia Waterfront Commission is doing currently, and what the perspective on community building is that seems to be the overriding.
Well, the best way to address that is to start not with the Waterfront Corporation itself, but with the development of the Anacostia Waterfront Initiative Plan, the framework plan, which began roughly now about 7 years ago. As I said earlier, there was always this thought of redeveloping the Anacostia waterfront. It's a 200-year-old thought. It's not new. When Mayor Williams came in, he, along with others, thought that, well, now things are changing. Let's see what we can do to help other areas of the city that not necessarily were not served properly, but still offer developmental opportunities to the city that could increase the tax base that would help us to do a lot more affordable programs in the needier areas. And he put together a team who began to really start assessing development and redevelopment opportunities here. They started out by bringing together a great team of planners, architects, and visionary people who began first to look at old plans and what had been contemplated here and there. Then they developed a process. And what they started out with, after they would do maybe this block here, let's say, then they would gather the community people in a charrette, which is just a think tank type of thing where you get people together to look at plans and talk about them. And they'd work on it. Well, you know, maybe we could move this building. And the community says, no, it would look better if we stood it on its edge and then did it this way and then did. Well, they did that for a period of almost 6 years. Did it for the entire waterfront, beginning here all the way around up the Anacostia River to the district line. As a result, they came up with what they call the Anacostia Waterfront Initiative. And this was a series of development plans that would help to transform this area. That was codified by the City Council into what they call the framework plan. Out of the framework plan, then they said, well, now we have this, we need some way of beginning to move this process along. And then the creation of the Anacostia Waterfront Corporation, which is now charged with implementing and developing the plans and moving them forward. I have to also preface all of my statements by saying that I think it's a fantastic plan. It's something that's long overdue. The greatest thrill for me is that I've been plucked by the mayor to be a part of it. I'm honored, flattered, and all of the other superlatives that go along with all of that great stuff. And I think it's a thing that for the future of you young gentlemen here, if you reach out and involve yourselves, it's going to leave you with a really fantastic city to grow up in, to manage as the mayors and the city councilmen of the future.
We're building a city that is demographically much different than the city that you grew up in. We're building tremendous number of low occupancy housing units, condominiums, apartments otherwise. It seems that public education, our schools, are going to be a much less significant presence in the city as a whole. What's the vision of community that's driving the development now? I know that's kind of a broad question.
It is, and I don't know if there is the vision of community, because one of the things that I remind people when asked that, community is up here. Community is not in the bricks and mortars. Community is how you relate to all that's going on about you and how you relate to the men and women next door or down the street. That's where the true community is. If they were to build all bunkers, if they were to demolish all of this today and build nothing but bunkers, but you still had that human interaction about all the facets of life within these bunkers, you have community. I think we put too much stock into looking at the physical structures rather than the human structures as being the key factor in community. If you go to the lower areas of Southwest where there used to be a clubhouse there, the Southwest Community House is still there. There's nothing fancy about that neighborhood. But when you go there and you hang out with some of these guys and listen to the talk, then you say, my God, these guys love each other and there's no stronger sense of community. Has nothing to do with the bricks and mortar. It's how you view yourself, the young man next to you, the young man next to you on this side. That's your community.
I know a half a dozen spots around this neighborhood where I see mostly older men gathered together under a tree, on a corner, somewhere, but there's a dozen of them, and they're just talking, hanging out. And you realize that there once was a significant place there, but that place is not what holds them together.
That's right.
It's each other that holds them together. Mm-hmm. And the place is background stuff.
Yeah, that's all. And that's very much true. Fourth and I, used to be a lunchroom over there is what we used to call it when I was a kid. There was a fence that was there. And by the time they demolished it, that fence was leaning like this. Because the older gentlemen, after they'd finished their jobs in the evening, would come home, clean up, and with their ties on, they would go there and they would lean against the fence in the evening and they would become great philosophers. You name the subject, they could discuss it, or they had an opinion about it. That's always been a tradition, and not just in Southwest, but you go to Harlan County, Kentucky, or Cave Town, Maryland, it's a storefront, it's a gas station. In some parts of Washington, it's not a corner, it's a barber shop. So that's a grand tradition, and I think you may be referring to some of the guys that still hang out down at Buzzard's Point. They've been doing it for generations. Yeah. I can walk down there and I probably would know most of the people by first name. Not only that, I knew their parents and their grandparents. Yeah. So that's a human trait that I hope no matter what this neighborhood or any neighborhood becomes in the future, it's a human trait that I hope we never lose. Because what it is, it's sitting around the campfire, sitting around the village green, sitting around the courthouse, sharing the stories. Right. And when you do that, you lose all history and all sense of history. Mm-hmm. So I think that should always remain as an integral part of any community and any society, anywhere.
Final question, I know that you've got to run. What's Southwest going to be like in 25 years? When these gentlemen reach the middle of their vocational lives, what's this neighborhood going to be about?
I'm hoping that it would be a very intellectually and culturally vibrant community with lots of art, with lots of people moving to and fro, and more importantly, lots of people interacting with one another. Because when I look at it, and from my perspective being on the board of the Waterfront Corporation, and also being one of those who has to oversee the Southwest development, whenever you hear us speak, you always hear us speaking in terms of how can we bring this back alive? How can we bring people here, provide them access to the river's edge, bring other immunities that are going to bring other people here and have them too to interact. That's what I would hope to see in 25 years, a community. So basically it's getting back to the future. What is it that we're not doing today that we did 35, 40, 50 years ago in communities? Now, thanks to air conditioning, we come home, it's a hot day, we lock our doors. Well, guess what? When I grew up here, no one had air conditioning. White, black, brown, no one had air conditioning. How did we cool off in the evenings? People would be sitting out on their stoops and they would talk. The children would play out front. You'd get hot and sweaty, you go in, take a bath, you put on some fresh clothing, and you come out. When it was extremely hot, we used to all sleep over at Haynes Point. Families would go over there and sleep. It was cool at night. So that's what they would do. But guess what? As archaic as it may sound, it made a strong community. It made a very, very strong community. So look back to some of the past things. You don't have to reinvent the wheel to make this a great community. If the Waterfront Corporation and all of our plans disappear tomorrow, you young people still have the opportunity and the obligation to make it a really fantastic community. You don't have to build anything. What you do is you build yourselves intellectually and culturally. As you go out into the world, you build your families, you build them the same way, you interact with others around you, and you share what you have intellectually and culturally. And you can do the same thing without the Waterfront Corporation. And then when one of you guys, you're the mayor, you can say, you know, a long time ago, this crazy guy came in and sat down and talked to us, and he told us a lot of this junk, but we didn't believe him. But you can do it. It's not rocket science. It's not hard to do. You're a human being. You have everything you need. You have everything that I had as a young man. You just need to go out and participate in it, become a part of it. Okay?
Thank you, Mr. Cole.
Thank you, gentlemen, for tolerating this and listening to me.